Good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 4th. Welcome to the new year. We're going to kick off writing this morning with some grammar practice. Go ahead. You should have a clauses and complex sentences packet. Go ahead and put your name on the top of that. You should have out a highlighter. You know, usually when we start a new skill, we do some highlighting to talk about it. Yes, Miss Stella.
I already did this page at that place.
I don't see it. All I have is what I gave you back. Okay, Avery, if you're still working on that math test, I need you to probably go in the hall and you can catch up on this later. Same for anyone else. If you're still working on the math test, or you can go across the hall. Okay. Okay, so a clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. I need us to highlight that, and I want to talk for a minute about the difference between a clause and a sentence, because a sentence also has a subject and a verb, right? Yes? Okay, so what could be the difference between a clause and a sentence? Does anyone have a thought about that? Yes, Gemma.
A clause could be a phrase, and a sentence has a period and a capital letter.
Okay, that's exactly correct. The 5 parts of a sentence are that it has to have a subject, it has to have a verb, it has to have a capital letter, it has to have a punctuation mark, and this last piece is really important. It has to make sense. Okay, it has to make sense all by itself. And that is going to be the big difference maker between a clause and a sentence. A dependent clause begins with a word such as because or when. What does that word dependent mean? If you're dependent on something, what does that mean? What does it mean if you're dependent on something? MJ?
But I mean, like, for a lot, does it mean like you're like locked in?
Kind of. That's not a bad thought. If you're dependent on something, that means you need that thing in order to survive. So you are dependent on your parents. You're dependent on them for food, shelter, clothing, all of the things that you need to help you live, right? Okay, you're dependent on your teacher. You're dependent on me for things that have to do with school, with homework, for getting help on your things that you don't understand. Okay, a rabbit is dependent on its environment. It has to live in the correct environment. It depends on its environment for its needs, for its shelter, for its food, for its water. Okay, so dependent means it is not able to stand by itself. It needs something else. Okay, so that's a dependent clause that needs something else. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. An independent clause can stand alone. An independent clause could also be a complete sentence. So, for example, our dependent clause, we notice this word when. Go ahead and circle when. Okay, that is going to be one of our conjunctions, when. And that makes that a dependent clause. So let's look at it. It has a subject. What is the subject of that clause? When we first saw Yosemite. What's the subject? Who is that clause about? Luke? No, that's a different noun. That's an object noun. I want the one that it's about. Who saw Yosemite? We. Okay, so underline that, and we're going to label that as our subject. Who first saw Yosemite? We first saw Yosemite. Okay, what is the verb or the predicate? We first saw Yosemite. What is being said about we? We what? Saw. Saw is our verb. Underline saw and label it with a V for our verb. Now, the reason that's a dependent clause, though, is because of that word when. When we first saw Yosemite. If I just said, we saw Yosemite, that's a complete sentence. I don't have to say anything else. But when I put that word when there, it makes me feel like you're getting ready to say something else. Like, when we first saw Yosemite, I thought it was amazing. When we first saw Yosemite, there was a bear. Whatever it's not complete, it's unfinished. My favorite emoji that I like to use when I'm texting is this one. Do you know her? Do you recognize her? It's the girl and she's like this. Everybody do this. Okay? Because it means like that doesn't make sense, or that I'm confused, or I don't understand. And this is how that makes me feel. If I come up to you and I say, when we first saw Yosemite, you'd be like, oh my gosh, Mrs. Smith is getting ready to tell me something else. And then I just walk away, you'd be like,
What?
right? So that's our dependent clause. Okay, the independent clause, it was a beautiful fall day. So what is our subject in that sentence? What was a beautiful fall day? It. Okay, so that's our subject. What is being said about it? It was. That's our verb. It's a linking verb. Was beautiful. Was a beautiful day. Okay? Now, if I just said to you, it was a beautiful fall day, you could be like, yeah, it was. Right? Like, that's a complete thought. Okay? So that's the difference between our dependent and independent clause. Yes, ma'am. Please stop doing that.
If you say it to someone, aren't they gonna be confused about when is it?
Well, like, we could be at the end of the day at dinner and it's been a really nice day and we all were outside playing. I could be, it was a really beautiful fall day today, right? Or it was a beautiful fall day. Okay? I kind of understand what you're saying, like, if you don't have the right context. Okay, a sentence made up of a dependent clause and an independent clause is a complex sentence. Okay, so here are some examples. When we first saw Yosemite, it was a beautiful fall day. So we have our dependent clause, when we first saw Yosemite. That word when lets us know that that's a dependent clause. And then we have our independent clause, it was a beautiful fall day, and I'm just going to underline that one twice. That's our independent clause. Do you like to label them? You want to make that dependent and independent? You could also say it the other way. It was a beautiful fall day when we first saw Yosemite. And it's still the same. Now you just have your dependent clause second, and your independent clause is first. Okay, other words that often introduce a dependent clause are since, although, if, until, unless, as, after, and before. Okay, so those are some good words to be looking for. They clue us in that there is a dependent clause and we could be using a complex sentence. If a dependent clause comes first in a complex sentence, then you need a comma. That is like in the first example. You could highlight this comma here. That's because the dependent clause is first. Okay, so let's look at these together, 1 through 6. Write I if the underlined group of words is an independent clause. Write D if it is a dependent clause. When we arrived at the campground, is that independent or dependent? Does it need more? Does it make complete sense? Or does it leave you feeling like this? Harper? Dependent. And then let's just go ahead and circle that word when. That's what clues us in that that's a dependent clause. Okay, number 2. We went for a hike. Is it independent or dependent? Kaden rates? Independent. There's none of these words, none of these conjunctions. Okay, we went for a hike. That is a complete thought. There's nothing else that needs to be added there. Okay. Until the sun set. Independent or dependent? Cordelia?
Dependent.
Dependent. That word until means that there's not enough. Okay, we need it. There's something that has to come before that to make sense, or after it to make sense. I would run. Complete thought or incomplete thought? AJ? Independent. That can stand all by itself. It doesn't need anything else. I would run. If you looked at me and you said, what would you do if you saw a bear? And I put, I would run. That's a complete thought. Okay? Before we went to bed. Before we went to bed. Stella? Dependent. That word before makes us know that there needs to be more for that to make sense. Before we went to bed makes me feel like this. Well, what? What happened before you went to bed? I don't know. Okay, I unpacked my supplies. Independent or dependent? Stella C. Independent. That's enough, all by itself. I unpacked my supplies. Okay, so we need to be on the lookout for these different clue words, since, although, if, until, unless, after, and before. And we need to be deciding, does it make sense all by itself, or do I need something else for that to make sense? Okay, write the clause in the sentence that is named in parentheses. Although we started late, we hiked 15 miles. What is dependent? Which part of that? Although we started late, or we hiked 15 miles. What is the dependent clause there that needs more? Carter?
Although we started late.
That's exactly right. Although we started late.
Who's this little Holly?
Okay, we were pitching our tent when we saw the bear. Where's the dependent clause there? We were pitching our tent when we saw the bear. Look for those clue words. Tell me the dependent clause. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 girls with their hands up. Where's my boys at? Carter Thompson, can you try? Well, that's our independent. That stands all by itself. We were pitching our tent. Then this second part, look at that word when we saw the bear. Okay, Raider? Which one's dependent? We were pitching our tent or when we saw the bear? When we saw the bear.
Because you're like, well, what happened next? So.
Right. That's right. When we saw the bear, leaves me feeling like this emoji. As we slowly moved away, the bear looked up. Which one is independent? What could stand all by itself? Levi? The bear looked up. Okay, and when do we use a comma? If the dependent clause comes first or second, when do we use the comma? If the dependent clause comes first. If the dependent clause comes first, we use a comma. Okay? So, in number 7 and number 9, the dependent clause is first. That is why those have commas. Okay? All right, we're going to put this in our blue binder behind our grammar tab. Did you bring a blue binder today? Okay. I think I forgot to tell your mom we need that. So we'll put that in our blue binder behind the grammar tab. And